We've been talking about, this is our first on-site talk. I wanted to look up the date of our last one, but it's been over a year, so we're really excited to have folks in the building and people to look at. All of our webinars have been online and virtual, and you're just staring at that screen, but it's really good that you all are here. So thank you all for coming to our Art at Noon talk, Women in Sculpture and Women in Sculptures, with artist Sarah Hempel Irani. My name is Corey Fry. I'm the exhibitions manager here at the Bella Plain. I want to mention a few things really quick. If you haven't had a chance to check out the exhibitions that we have up right now, there's 4 exhibitions, 2 on the second floor and 2 on the main floor. Check those out. There's some really great work. Also, pick up one of our magazines because we're about to start summer classes here. We're registering for summer classes, so if you're interested in taking any classes here, there's some really great classes, so check them out. Kind of across disciplines, so there's something for everybody if you're interested. At the end of Sarah's talk, there'll be a Q&A, so be thinking as she's talking about questions that you might have about her process or anything really, and we'll set aside some time for question and answer at the end. I'm going to read to you really quick Sarah's bio and then let her get started. Originally from Michigan, Sarah Hempel Irani moved to Maryland to apprentice with the former artist-in-residence at the National Cathedral. For the past 20 years, she's been sculpting expressive figures in clay, bronze, and stone. Sarah earned her MA in Medieval and Renaissance Studies from Hood College, has been a visiting artist and speaker at Ave Maria University, Grove City College, Slippery Rock University, which is a great name for a university, Covenant College, as well as Rotary clubs and civic organizations. In addition, she's been a featured guest on the Seminary Explores and Makers and Mystics podcasts. She works out of her studio at the Griffin Art Center on West 5th Street in downtown Frederick. And Sarah is currently working on a 7-foot, 6-inch bronze monument to fashion icon Claire McCardell for Carroll Creek Linear Park. The project is being driven by the Frederick Art Club in celebration of its 120th anniversary. Sarah is best known for her 2 larger-than-life-size sculptures, the Virgin Mary and St. Joseph cut from Carrara marble at Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Church in Potomac, Maryland. She articulated the clay sculptures in her Frederick studio and then worked with an Italian marble studio to have them carved. Sarah, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much. This lecterne's not quite tall or too tall for me. It is so awesome to see real faces. I've been doing these Zoom talks and you can't see anyone. So I'm like, I don't know if I'm boring everyone to tears or if they're excited or what. So this is a real treat. Thank you so much for being here. So today I'm going to be talking about women in sculpture, i.e. artists, and women in sculptures, i.e. the subject of sculptures. And I'm kind of both. So it has 3 parts. So I'm going to talk about sculptures that we can see in our region, and I'm going to talk about some sculptors that I look up to, and then I'm going to talk about what I've been up to during the pandemic, which is the Claire McCardell project. And I'm going to go through my process a little bit and hopefully tie all these things together. So here is a picture of me at 21 years old, a brooding and enthusiastic artist. And I was going to go out into the world and be a great sculptor. And I'm from a small town in Michigan, and I went to a small college in Michigan, okay? And we didn't have access to a lot of public art. The public art that I saw was on travels or in churches. So when I came here to work for Jay Carpenter, who had worked at the Washington National Cathedral, if you can imagine, like, I'm the world's most enthusiastic person. I was so excited. And I spent every weekend down in Washington, D.C. So this is the great American city with the great American monuments and neoclassical sculptures, and oh my goodness, I was over the moon. So I had to visit all the monuments, right? The Lincoln, Daniel Chester, French national treasure, the somberness of the Korean War Memorial, and of course the wall with its 3 soldiers. And Jay, who I worked for, he did the weapons on this, so I felt really connected to it. The Iwo Jima, this thing is enormous. It's just so overwhelming. And of course, the Grant Memorial right in front of the Capitol. The drama of these enormous horses, and then there's Grant right in the middle there. It's just awe-inspiring. But where were all the sculptures of women? I saw a lot of guys on horses and presidents, but where were all the women? Well, Washington has plenty of women. Okay, so here's a sculpture to a man with a woman on top there. Oh, the beautiful Aristide Maillol sculptures at the Hirshhorn Garden. Lady Justice, infamously nude. I don't know if you all remember them trying to cover up during press conferences. And this lovely fountain. Okay. This is Valor from the Art of War. So there are a lot of sculptures of women in Washington, and most of them are nude, which I have no problem with whatsoever. I work with the figure, and I love it. But where were the real women? We use women's figures to illustrate justice and freedom, liberty, this sort of thing. But what about real women? I found one. The Vietnam Women's Memorial by Glenna Goodacre. And I love this. It's sort of invoking the pietà, and it's so round. You can walk around it, and it works from every direction. But these aren't specific women. This is sort of representing women in general who helped with the war effort. So where are the, real historical women? Did you know that currently less than 7% of more than 5,100 monuments in the United States honor women? So let that sink in for a minute. Now, of course, there's a lot of reasons for this. The decision makers, who we choose to honor, who gets to make those choices, that sort of thing. I did find some in Washington, D.C. And again, this is the city with the most sculptures, in a tiny area in the United States. Maybe New York City. I found 10. And there may be more, and if you find some more, let me know. Because I found 10 of them, and I heard about one that's in the works. Now here's St. Bernadette. She is at the Franciscan monastery. So I only chose sculptures we could see outdoors, so that anyone could go down to Washington and find the women. So St. Bernadette. Oh, there's St. Joan of Arc. This is our earliest one that I found from 1922. And this was originally made in France in the 1800s, and they made a copy for Washington. Now this sculpture doesn't look like an actual person to me, but it's supposed to be Jane Delano, who was a nurse with the National Red Cross, and so it's at their headquarters down in Washington. Now it's a lovely sculpture, and it sort of honors all of the nurses there, but it's the Jane Delano Memorial. Then there's this sculpture. This is Queen Isabella I at the Pan American Union Building. So we have a Renaissance queen here. This is Olive Risley Seward, and this is a private residence, but if you drive, I've seen it from the car, but it's not on the mall or anything. But it's out in a visible place. This was put up in 1974. This is the Mary McLeod, Bethune sculpture. And as you may recognize the style, this is the same artist who did that big Kennedy head at the Kennedy Center and the Einstein. And this was the first sculpture of an African American woman in the nation's capital. And I suspect that it might be the only one. Maybe there's some new ones. This is a Venezuelan novelist, Teresa de la Parra, at the Organization of American States. And Eleanor Roosevelt, this is the one that most of you have probably seen. She's at the FDR Memorial. And again, she's a part of a man's memorial. She didn't even really get her own, though there is another sculpture of her indoors or at the National Cathedral. We can't forget the Virgin Mary, which I'm sure this isn't the only one in Washington, but this is at the Basilica. And then there's Crown Princess Martha of Norway, which is at the Norwegian Residencies, which is technically not even the United States, even though you can see it from Massachusetts Avenue. Has anyone seen this? I remember driving by down Massachusetts Avenue, and I almost got in an accident because I thought, what? Is that a sculpture of a woman in Washington, D.C.? There's 10. And now in the rotunda in the Capitol building, some more have arrived. I've seen the suffragettes, and I've seen Rosa Parks, and they're sort of swapping things out as our nation, sort of the collective values evolve. So these are women in sculptures. So I'm going to stop for a moment and tell this story. When I was a young sculptor and I was working on the Virgin Mary and St. Joseph in my studio, I was invited to a cocktail party in Georgetown. Now, I don't want to keep reminding you that I'm a girl from a small town in Michigan. So this was an incredible opportunity. And the party was for sculptors working in classical monuments, this sort of thing, and architects also working in this framework. So I arrived. I didn't know anybody, and I felt pretty nervous, but I noticed some beautiful drawings on the wall, and I went up to them, and they were signed by John Singer Sargent in a private residence. So already I'm overwhelmed with enthusiasm. And so as I got to know people throughout the night, it hit me. I'm the only woman here as a professional. I'm the only woman here who's not someone's date. And it reminded me of my favorite book, which is The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle. And if you haven't read this book, it seems like it's for kids, but it is a book that I've read over and over again. But the main character is this unicorn, and she finds out that she's the only one. So she goes on a quest looking for the others. And so she asks the creatures and people she meets along the way, have you seen the others? And so like the unicorn, I went on a quest looking for the others. Now, I have plenty of amazing mentors in my life who are sculptors, who have helped me along the way. And then, of course, I have my dead sculptor heroes like Michelangelo and Bernini and Verrocchio, and these are my teachers. You know, to me, they're very much alive. And so when I go to the National Gallery, I'm visiting my friends and I'm learning, and these are my teachers. And I know a lot of artists feel that way. But I didn't have any women sculptors to look up to or whose lives to look at. So I had to go on a quest to look and find where are the others. So I'm going to keep this. There are plenty of amazing women sculptors, but I'm going to really keep this local so that if you want to go and find them, you can. So the first woman that I'd like to talk about is Edmonia Lewis, who worked at the turn of the century. And she did this wonderful sculpture here of the death of Cleopatra. I know at the time when she was working in neoclassicism, everything was very idealized. And, you know, this is in marble and it's still very idealized, but she's showing a little bit more feeling and a little bit more, she's bitten by a snake when she dies. So there's a little freshness there. And you can see this sculpture at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And she also did a lot of portraits of her patrons. Anna Quincy Watterson and her family were patrons of Edmonia Lewis. Now, she was a person who sort of fabricated stories about herself and created her own mythology in a way, much like our friend Michelangelo. Her brother came into some money and she was able to go to Oberlin College. And she moved to Rome to learn marble carving, and she met some other artists there. And she actually had a very successful career as a sculptor. And yet she died in relative obscurity. And I had to go digging for her. I don't think we learned about her in art history class. But likewise, you can see this portrait of Annie Quincy Watterson at the Smithsonian Art Museum. So the next artist I would like to talk about is Vinnie Ream. Now, you may have heard about Vinnie Ream because she's famous for doing this portrait of Lincoln. Now, she has the most amazing life story. She is the youngest woman to have been commissioned by the government and the first woman. She was only 18 years old when she did this portrait of Lincoln. And she was very persistent, and her family knew Lincoln's family, and so she kind of, was bold, asked for what she wanted. She studied with Clark Mills, who famously did the sculpture of Andrew Jackson on the rearing horse up at Lafayette Square. Now, what's amazing about that feat is that he was able to cast that bronze so that the horse was only on 2 feet, which is a feat of engineering, especially for that time. She had an amazing life and likewise went to Rome. Now, there was a group of American women working in Rome. So the sense of community is really, really important, I think, for everyone, but for artists. The unicorn didn't want to feel all alone in the wood and went to look for others. And I think humans are very much like that. And so she was there in Rome with Harriet Hosmer, who's a famous American sculptor, and Edmonia Lewis. And there were some very famous literary figures in Rome at the time. So she got married, and he put a lot of restrictions on her. It was, this was the 1800s, early 1900s. She couldn't be a proper wife and a mother and also be a sculptor. So for 40 years, she didn't make any art. But she came back pretty strong when her kids grew up. This is a place everybody knows, Farragut, Admiral Farragut. Did anybody here know that a woman sculpted Admiral Farragut at Farragut? I didn't either, and also Vinnie, it's like, oh, is that, we don't know. And most of the time people don't know who made these because you're driving around the traffic circle. So here's a close-up of that. Now this is a pretty traditional, soldier, general, kind of strong bronze. She also began this sculpture of Sequoia that's in the Capitol Rotunda. It's the first sculpture of a Native American in the Rotunda. And she died before it was finished, so it was completed by another sculptor and placed in 1917. So another sculptor that I've long admired is Anna Hyatt Huntington. And even though she was born in the 19th century, she lived a very long life into the 20th. She did this sculpture of Joan of Arc in New York City. And I do believe that this is the first public monument done by a woman in New York City. So that's barrier breaking. Now you have to go up to New York City to see that sculpture, and as well as Sybil Ludington's ride. Recently I just saw some memes about Sybil Ludington. She's sort of the female Paul Revere. She did this longer ride, faster ride, and nobody's heard of her, of course. But the scale model here is down in Washington, and it is at the National Women's Party Fine Art Collection. So I have not been there to see it in person, but it's a fun sculpture with this really fiery woman with, I love her face, is screaming with her arm up. And I forgot to mention the flight into Egypt. So this is at the shrine, also by her. The next artist is Glenna Goodacre, who I mentioned at the beginning, who did the Women in Vietnam Memorial. Now, Glenna Goodacre was somebody that I had been acquainted with, not in person, but her work as I was in college, dreaming of being a monumental sculptor and thinking, are there any women doing this? And in fact, Glenna Goodacre is doing it. And you may have a little Glenna Goodacre in your pocket. She did the Sacagawea coin, and she's done wonderful, wonderful monuments around the country, and she just died last year during the pandemic. Now, I would be amiss to miss these two wonderful sculptors, Louise Bourgeois, and, I practiced pronouncing her name. Here's a quiz. Does anyone know who did Puelai? This one? Madalena Abakanowicz. Have you seen this work at the National Gallery Sculpture Garden? I even practiced her name yesterday. Now, at the National Gallery Sculpture Garden, there are lots of wonderful sculptures there, and these are only two that were done by women. So we can see that there's a tremendous imbalance, both women in sculptures, wait, which way is which? Women doing sculptures and women featured in sculptures as actual people, not as decorations or ideas in this genre. I don't want to disparage the nude or using figures allegorically. It's just a different expression. So when we're talking very specifically about monuments, they are to commemorate an individual, individuals, or an event. So these clearly are not either of those, but I didn't want to miss them in case you are looking for some incredible sculptors on your next visit to Washington. You'll want to go to the NGA Sculpture Garden and check these out. So, where does that bring us? The Claire McCardell Project. And so the reason I wanted to talk about women in sculptures and women in sculpture is the Claire McCardell Project brings those things together. And so this whole project was born from the Frederick Art Club, which, if you don't know this about the Frederick Art Club, it is one of the oldest organizations in Frederick. They just celebrated their 120th anniversary a few years ago. I think we might be on 122, is that right?
Yeah, close to 124.
So during the Victorian era, these art clubs were really popular, and a lot of cities had art clubs where women would get together and learn about art and offer philanthropy to the community. But Frederick's Art Club has been going for 122 years. And so to celebrate the 120th anniversary, some women from the club got together and thought, what can we do to really celebrate this 120 years? And when the Historic Society came to give a presentation on a creative woman from Frederick, they did a presentation on Claire McCardell. Now, if you've never heard of Claire McCardell, she is so astonishing. She's the most famous designer that you've never heard of. And maybe now you have heard of her because she's been in the news lately. So Claire McCardell was born in 1908. So she's coming up at the new 20th century, and she was born right here in Frederick, Maryland. But Claire gave us clothes we can move in. Now, it sounds like a small thing that we take for granted because every day we get dressed, but every day we don't put on a corset and we don't have servants trying to tie us into our clothes. We have clothes where we can move our arms and we can bend. We have clothes that we can do sports in. We have clothes with pockets, or some of us do. Claire gave us pockets. We have shoes that don't have high heels. Have you ever tried to run in high heels? It's really hard. So Claire McCardell, she elevated women by giving us clothes we could work in, where we can do sports in, we can move our bodies, there's no restriction, we can dress ourselves. Now, I don't think Claire set out to be a revolutionary or a feminist, but she was. And so if you have pockets, and if you can move your body, and if you can breathe a full deep breath, can you thank Claire McCardell? And yet nobody's heard of her. She died fairly young. She died in her 50s. And even though she was enormously famous during her lifetime, even being featured on the cover of Time magazine, her family decided to close her label because, to quote her brother, all of Claire's ideas were truly her own. So many fashion houses that we think of, like Chanel, Coco Chanel is no longer with us, but her house continues on. So Claire's house closed. And yet you can find some of her dresses on eBay and Etsy and wonderful vintage shops. But she's seeing a resurgence because we all want pockets and we all want shoes we can walk in. So the women of the art club said, well, let's do something to honor Claire. Maybe a little plaque. Or maybe a bas-relief sculpture. Or maybe a little sculpture. We could do a little sculpture, right? Okay, so this project kept getting bigger and bigger. And then someone from the art club said, do you all know Sarah? Sarah who? Well, Sarah, she works on 5th Street. She's a woman and she's a sculptor, and that's it. And so the Frederick Art Club came to me and said, would you like to do this project? Now, I was overwhelmed and honored, and this is a dream come true for me. And yet the women said that they were shocked that I said okay because they didn't have any money at the time. So we were kind of taking a chance on one another. But we fully believed that Claire McCardell was somebody who needed to be honored. People need to know who she is. So I'm going to talk about my journey with Claire McCardell, also known as what I did during the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, when we can still get together, I had to get to know Claire. And I sort of joke a little bit that I hang out with dead people in the studio and I make friends with them, which is 100% true, because I don't know this person. I can't really coax them out of the clay. And so I saw this picture of Claire and this picture of me, and I thought, you know, we have a lot in common already. I mean, I like comfortable shoes, I like pockets, and I work with my hands, just like Claire, my hands and my head. And so we started to get to know each other, and she's become my hero. So the first thing that I did was come up with ideas. What should the pose look like? I did several different 18-inch sculptures in the art club. You know, I like this, I don't like this. And so it was a real collaborative effort. And I know that many artists bristle a little bit at folks telling them what to do. But the women at the Frederick Art Club are the most insightful and intelligent and ambitious women. And so together we were able to really come up with some cool ideas. So I presented image after image and we landed on this one. So this is fully in the round, like Glenna Goodacre's Vietnam Memorial, so that people can walk around it. And I do a lot of religious art. In religious art, we have a thing called attributes. Each saint has a prop that kind of tells you who the saint is. So when you see a man with a beard and keys, you know that's St. Peter, even though we don't know what his face looks like. So we gave Claire an attribute, and her attribute is the dress form, which signals to the viewer that we're encountering a designer, a seamstress, somebody to do with fashion and garments. And so then the person is able to walk around and get to know Claire. And you can't see from this picture, but she has her hand in her pocket, and she's wearing flats. So after we did some fundraising, and the city of Frederick, the people here have been so encouraging and enthusiastic about this project that the fundraising really, really was fun. And we got to know a lot of really great people, and we got some wonderful support. Now, we had the idea, we had the funds, we had the little model. It was time to get to work. So the first thing I did is I made a half-scale model. and I built an armature. I brought a small one to show you what an armature is. Now, of course, bigger, it's made of steel, but it's like a little skeleton that holds the clay. Otherwise, the clay will collapse under its own weight. Now, ceramic artists do not use armatures because they will cause the work to explode. We don't want that. So I use plastiline, which is an oil-based clay. So there's no firing. It makes your hands nice and moisturized, and it's stable, so it doesn't crack when I leave. It gets squishy when it's hot and really hard when it's cold. So this winter was difficult, to say the least. So you can see, it creates a nice, I like that. So when building an armature at 4 feet, I need a little bit more strength than aluminum. So we had to weld together pieces of steel, and I felt pretty cool with these heavy-duty gloves and the sparks flying, and I had my helmet on, and it felt pretty awesome. So it doesn't look like much, but it'll do the job. The arms are aluminum, so they're a little flexible, and the legs are flexible, but that torso is nice and rigid so that it doesn't collapse. So here I am in the studio with my favorite studio assistant, Tom Sawyer, who's my dog. And the first thing that I did was I sculpted a nude. And a lot of people want to know, why in the world would you spend all of your time doing the nude and then doing clothes? And it's because we need the clothes to reveal the figure. And we need the clothes to hang. So there's the bony landmarks like the shoulders and the elbows and the pelvis. We need to make sure that the leg pops out in the right spot. And so one of my mentors, he said, if you don't sculpt a nude first, it may end up looking like a pile of laundry with a head on top, and you don't want that. So I sculpted the nude. And Tom Sawyer really isn't that much help. So as I worked for several months working up the sculpture, and then I had a finished nude. And you can see the dress form in the foreground that I bought at the antique store. So then it was time to add drapery. So what I do is I make sausages with the clay, long sausages, and lay it on the figure. And so drapery is flat, and then when you move it around a figure, and when you gather the folds, they go up and they go down. And there's sort of rules of physics or something governing that. So really have to study the way that the fabric is moving and to get the weight of the fabric. So having the nude underneath really establishes how the fabric is going to fall and where it's going to fall. So here I am almost done with the scale model and saving her hand for last because I had to do the drapery and then the hand and the pocket, and then I could do the sleeve. So once I was done with the scale model, this is about 4 feet tall, we had folks in the studio to offer comments, and I changed the face a few times. And once it was ready to go, we had to enlarge it. So how do you go from 4 feet to 7.5 feet? Whew. Well, I sent it to a enlarging studio, and they used what's called a Cartesian box method, which if you can remember back to middle school math, remember the grid where you have to plot x and y? Well, and we add z for the third dimension. So this is a pretty old-fashioned way to enlarge, but I'm sort of an old-fashioned sculptor, so it worked. And when it came back to the studio, it came back in pieces. I like to toss myself in pictures for scale. So I remember sitting there this day thinking, oh my word, it's really, really big. And somehow I have to finish this. So for the next 6 months, I came into my studio every day, and here you can see the 18-inch model, and in the background you can see the 4-foot model with all little tiny dots over it, and then you can see how much bigger the full-scale sculpture is. Now, a lot of people want to know, why couldn't I go from 18 inches to full scale? It's 5 times as big. So if you make a tiny measurement error, you multiply that by 5, it's an enormous measurement error. So this gets us a little bit closer to really accurate measurements. The genius of my enlarging studio is that they made it so that it comes apart. So we were able to take off the torso and lower it down on a hydraulic lift so that I could get a little closer. So here I am with the mostly finished enlargement. I'm not allowed to show the whole thing. You'll have to come to the unveiling in October to see the finished product. Well, we're not done yet. So once the clay is done, we have to take it to a mold making studio. Here I am with my crew. Hello, Richard. And my husband, Eric, there. And you can see I'm looking back terrified. And what I love about this picture is over my studio door, I have a sign that says Noli Timere. Does anyone know what that means? Anyone take Latin? This means do not be afraid. And so in the Christian Bible, this is repeated over and over again. Do not be afraid, do not be afraid. And so I have this sign over my door to remind me when I go into the studio, do not be afraid. Making art is terrifying. You're putting yourself out there. You're making a lot of little decisions. There's always a better artist out there. But do not be afraid. And then as I leave the studio, I'm going into the world, and maybe the art's going into the world, and that's really scary. But do not be afraid. But I am terrified at this moment because you can see this doesn't fit through the door. So we had to tip it and carry it and put it back up, and then go through another door and tip it and carry it and put it back up. And a third door, tip it and carry it and put it in the back of a truck and drive it to Baltimore. So we're in the front of the U-Haul hearing, in the back, and I'm like, oh, please do not break. This clay is soft. It is hot. We managed to get there mostly in one piece. I made a few minor repairs, and it was so difficult to leave. I was fussing with my tools. I brought some tools with me, and I was fussing with the clay, and my husband had to say, you have to step away. Noli timere, do not be afraid. It's done. We can step away. So the mold is done in many, many pieces. And we had to transport it to a foundry in Colorado. So my husband got a new truck, and he wanted to haul stuff. So we got a tiny trailer and put this huge pile of rubber and plaster in the back of his truck. Now, I brought a tiny one as a sample. So this goes around the clay. So it's liquid, and you paint this latex. It's like you're doing a science experiment. And the latex sets up so that it's rigid, but it's still flexible. And then there is a plaster shell to protect it and keep it stiff. So then this is peeled off the clay, and all of that clay and armature comes back to the studio. And I've spent the past, 4 weeks picking clay back off the sculpture. A lot of people want to know, is that sad to destroy what I've just spent 6 months making? And quite the contrary. To me, taking off the clay means that that part is done. It means that I can start dreaming up the next thing. And so it's sort of celebratory, even if it is really tedious and physically difficult. It's 7.5 feet tall. And you can see here, I am not. So what happens at the foundry? I don't know if you guys have the rest of the day, but what happens at the foundry is a lot. It's there for 6 months, and it undergoes what's called the lost wax process. And I'm just going to go through this quickly because it's kind of a separate thing. This is considered fabrication, and so what I do is the clay and the design work. And while this is in Colorado, I'm working with a vendor out in Minnesota to do a bronze or a granite pedestal with her name on it, and the art club is working on landscape design and wayfinding, and it's not just a figure. This is a whole environment. It's kind of a park within a park. And so there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of project management. And if you were to tell me when I was in college, that 21-year-old, I'm going to become a great artist, that I was actually going to end up becoming a project manager, I would have not believed you. So the lost wax process. After we get the mold, they pour wax in it, and they get the wax to just the right thickness, and that wax is kind of like a new sculpture. It's the same thing that I made in wax, but in sections. They don't put it all together. And so they do what's called chasing and pointing, which is cleaning up the wax, filling holes. And I'm going to go out on the 23rd to check on that and make sure they're doing a good job. So after the wax, they do this thing called spruing, where they put little channels in wax on the sculpture so that when they pour the bronze, the gas can escape. And then they make the shell by dipping the wax sculpture in layers of liquid porcelain and sand, and then they put it into a kiln, and all the wax drains out, hence the lost wax. So the wax is reused for the next thing. And then once they have an empty shell, they can pour in the molten bronze, which is 2,000 degrees of hot metal. And once the metal cools, it starts to crack the porcelain, and then they whack off the porcelain with hammers, and they have bits of bronze that they now have to weld together. So all this is being welded together. It looks like a hot mess, and then they have to chase and point the bronze, make sure all the seams are just so. Oh, the metal chasing. Again, this is why it takes 6 months. And at the end, once the metal looks good, they clean it up and they do a patina. And the patina is done by spraying on chemicals to expedite oxidation. And then they hit it with heat and cool it, and it's sort of this, it's almost like painting it, but you're doing it with chemicals and heat. And then once the patina is done and it's just the way you like it, cool it off and add a layer of wax. And once the wax is done, you polish it, and then it's ready to ship back to Frederick. And I will go out again to Colorado to make sure they're doing it just right. So once it comes back to Frederick in September, we'll coordinate with the garden people and the stone people and install all of these pieces together. And if you've been walking down Carroll Creek, you will see the sign where she's going to be. And I hope that when we have the final unveiling, that I'll see some eyes, I can't see your whole faces, and you can see the finished piece of sculpture. And I hope that when you see sculpture, you think how much went into creating these things. Even small sculptures are a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of time and resources. So that was a lot to sum up the past 20 years of being a woman in sculpture and looking for the other women and for looking for women in sculptures. And I'd like to think that we're going to take that 7% and get it closer to 50, but we have a lot of work to do in this country and probably around the world. So I'm sure that you have lots of questions or want to come and touch some of the props. So I'll take some questions. Does that sound good? Yes?
So, when in your life, in your young life, did you say, I want to be a 3D artist?
That is a really, really good question. So I think that it was building the whole time. So one of my earliest memories was when I was 4 years old and I wanted to make a decoration for Christmas. And I thought, well, I'm going to make all the reindeer. And I said to my mom, I said, I know reindeer have 4 legs, but when I look to the side, I can only see 2. I don't know what to do. Now, mind you, I was a little kid, and so I was really wrestling with how to make something 3-dimensional. Now, of course, I like to play with clay and this and that and make I loved making dioramas in paper, like cut paper. But then I remember going to Mass with my grandmother. Now, I did not grow up Catholic, but she did, and I went to St. Anthony's with her. And I remember saying, Granny, how can anyone pay attention with all these cool sculptures everywhere? Like, this is amazing. And she's like, shh. And then when I was a kid, we moved to Japan. And in Japan, they have several of these gigantic Buddhas, which they're sort of like temples and sculptures. And so I remember going inside of one. And it was the coolest thing. I mean, it was clearly a really sacred place, and you could look out the eyes, and there were prayers, and it was sculpture that was really accessible to everyone. Like, I didn't have to even be a Buddhist. I didn't have to go to a museum. You know, I grew up in a rural place where I didn't have a lot of access to art resources. And so the sculptures that I saw were ones that were in public. And I always wanted to know, who did this? And I would run up to them and you know, wanted to touch them and all of that. But when I got to college, we had the most amazing sculpture professor at the school I went to. And that first semester was so difficult. And I had thought I was really good at art prior to going to my first sculpture class. And I cried for a whole semester because it was so difficult. And after that, I just couldn't let it go. And I ended up selling that sculpture, and I got a commission, and I was like, I guess this is what I do. So that was a long answer to that, so yes?
I have three. Okay, yes. They're real short answers. First is, does that clay that you use stay wet forever?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so this is an oil-based clay, and in order to get it soft, I heat it. It has wax in it, and in order to get it crisp and hard to use a detail tool, I cool it. And so I use it over and over again. It lives in bins in my studio. So if you put it in a kiln, it would just melt.
Secondly,
Mm-hmm.
when you sent it off to the enlargement studio and it came back, it looked from the slide like there's real rough on the outside. It's stuck pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have to do the details all over again?
Yes, so the enlarging studio, they will take it to however you tell them. So I said to take it to about 87% or 85%. Because I wanted to get my hands in all those details, in the seams, in the fingernails, in the portrait, and all of that. So enlarging studios can do different things. So some people will have it completely enlarged, but I feel like so much is lost in that enlargement, and I really wanted to participate in the finished work. Mm-hmm.
Why tear it up? Why not just keep the piece when you send it off to the foundry? Why tear up the
Well, yes. So after it comes back, I tear up the clay and use it again. So a couple of reasons. Practical reasons. It's soft forever, so it takes up a lot of space in my studio, and I need the clay for the next sculpture. And once the mold is taken, the sculpture's done, and so I don't need to keep that clay around anymore. And for the small one, I can take a mold of that and make casts. So I don't, it's sort of part of the process. It's not the finished work. You know, it's on your way to the finished work. And Asha, I saw that you had a question.
Yeah. So you know how army people use horses? When did women start to go on
horses? Ooh. You know, I'm not sure, but it was considered unseemly for many years for women to ride horses. And we don't very often see women on horses in sculpture, except for in Joan of Arc, which we showed that first Joan of Arc. And then Sybil Luddington, who, if I can go back to, see if I can go all the way to the beginning, she is riding side saddle in that sculpture. I don't know if you noticed. Yeah, no, side saddle is very difficult. I don't know if we can go all the way to the beginning here. But that's a good question. We tend to see, so here's Joan of Arc, and she is riding a horse similar to how a man would have in those days, which got her in some trouble. And then Sybil Luddington here, you can see she's riding side saddle. But there's a great tradition of equestrian sculptures of showing generals and kings on horses, but very rarely do we see a woman on a horse. So this is actually quite an incredible feat to show that. Yes?
So then do these women just literally helping people in the army, or they just doing?
So the Vietnam Women's Memorial, women were not allowed to be in combat for many years. I don't even know if they are now, but they certainly were part of the war effort and certainly helped. Yes. So this is really a wonderful sculpture to honor the many women who helped in the war, even if we don't know the particular women. So, any other questions, Corey?
now that you're on sort of the downward slope of this project, do you have ambitions for anything new? What's in your sights for next?
Oh, that is a hard question. So immediately afterwards, I said, I'm never doing this again. This is the worst thing I can possibly do. I'm so tired. This is so large. And a friend of mine many years ago quipped that this is some sort of divine sense of humor to make me, who's 5'2", interested in monumental statuary. It's physically exhausting. So that lasted for about 3 weeks, and then I was like, ooh, what can I do now? So what I'm doing now is cleaning up my studio. I'm redesigning my website. So this summer, if you're online, check out my website. And there's going to be some educational materials there too. I do have a smaller private commission that I need to finish. And I don't know what's next. So I'm excited to imagine. I do hope that this becomes a trend not only for me as an artist, but for our country to put more women on pedestals. I'm going to go all the way. So if you're online, if that's your thing, you can follow me on Instagram or on my website. And when I'm in Colorado, I'll post some updates of what's happening in the foundry. And I still have to get the stone from Minnesota, so I'm working with the fabricators there. And what's next is still a mystery. After, yes?
Let me follow that up. What is your dream project?
My dream project. I always ask questions this to other people, and it usually throws them off. And now I'm like, I don't know. There's a couple of women I would like to do portraits of. I would love to do a portrait of Jane Goodall while she's still with us. And I would love to do a portrait of Malala. I have done portraits of her from photographs, but to sit with her, I could not read her book, and I'm going to cry. I got to the first page, and I couldn't stop crying, and then I read the second page, and I had to start again, and then I tried to read it to my daughter, and she said, Mom, you're a mess. Like, you can't read this book. So women like Malala and like Claire McCardell, who just showed up to do what they do. You know, Malala didn't try starting a revolution. She just wanted to go to school. Claire McCardell just wanted to wear comfortable clothes. Jane Goodall was curious about apes. And so doing portraits of women like that nourishes my soul. So I would love to meet some of those incredible women. Unfortunately, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is no longer with us, and I know that I did start a tiny one, so if you know anyone. But women like that, I would like to definitely do that. And also a dream would be, to have a large public work in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital. I would have to pinch myself 100 times over to realize that. But honestly, Claire McCardell was, this has been a dream, to put a woman on a pedestal. And so it felt all very providential, even though it's been very difficult. This year has been very, very hard. Yes?
I always wanted to ask somebody this. When you see those monumental sculptures of a soldier on a horse, is there a horse specialist? Can you get like a stock horse?
They seem like it would take 3/4 of the effort.
It would, yes, and that's possibly my next effort. My daughter Asha, who's with us today, she has been riding horses, and every time I go to the barn, I think I'm bringing clay next time. A lot of these really big monuments, the sculptors will have apprentices. Like I was an apprentice. Now, when I was an apprentice, I did the pant legs, and I did St. Paul's chains, and big cloaks, things like that. So they probably would have apprentices kind of building it up, and then the master sculptor would do the horse's features and that sort of thing. But I don't know anybody who specifically just goes around doing horses for equestrian sculptures. There are people who mostly do equestrian sculptures. But that's another skill. Maybe that's the next thing, and then Jane Goodall. Yes, I saw.
Yeah, it was mentioned in the beginning. I heard medieval studies at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, was that in anticipation
Well, it was sort of during when I was working on this huge marble Virgin Mary and St. Joseph. So it was during that time I was taking classes at Hood because I'm very curious. And I really got caught up I mean, I love art history. To me, art history is a story of people. You know, it's everything coming together, religion and politics and history and aesthetics, philosophy all coming together. So I just kept taking classes, and I kind of got carried away. So, so I ended up finishing the degree, and I wrote my thesis on Pierrot della Francesca, who is an Italian painter. And I wrote about a particular sculpture. It's called the Madonna Misericordia. And what was interesting to me about this sculpture is the relationship between the artist, his patron, and then the community where the sculpture would exist. Because the kind of sculpture that I do isn't for me. You know, it's a community effort. And so I'm very interested in that relationship. Yeah, Pierrot della Francesca. And I can show you a picture if you want afterwards. Yeah. So his, and the work that he did was kind of old-fashioned. You know, this is the beginning of the Renaissance, so perspective was really in, but he did a gold background because his community, which was a rural community, wasn't quite ready for, you know, Michelangelo just yet. And so the community's needs were different than maybe what the artist's needs were. And so for different clients, Pierrot did, you know, that sort of more Renaissance background with depth and the scuttled background like Leonardo did. So anyhow, I could go on about that. So yes, more questions. Yeah.
Sorry, just one more. So is sculpting, is that your main medium, or do you do other forms?
Yes. Sculpting is mostly what I do, though my first love is always drawing. I quote Leonardo da Vinci, who said, drawing is at the beginning of everything. And so I think drawing is you know, so immediate, and it connects you to the subject and to your pencil. I don't do it as often as I used to. I used to be very religious about going to drawing group every week for years. And I just don't anymore. And I do some watercolors, but only for fun. And I think every artist needs to have a hobby that's not for sale. So, when I travel, I like to take some watercolors. Mm-hmm. Yes, one more. Yes, no, I love it.
This is a great opportunity.
Yes,
we were doing the nude stage of the statue. Did you do it entirely from two-dimensional photographs, historical photographs, or did you have a live model?
No, so what I use a live model, and I found a model who miraculously had the same exact measurements as Claire McCardell. And so I had a costumer make a historic facsimile of one of Claire's dresses. And so the model came to the studio, and I've worked with her on many projects. So it was really fun. And so I worked from a real model. But then the portrait, because obviously Claire's not here, I had to go by photographs, which is incredibly challenging because you have different time periods and different angles. And Claire favored one side of her face, so I had 0 photographs of the other side of her face, except for from the front. So I had to fabricate it. And the hardest thing about doing these historic portraits is it has to be recognizable as this person, but nobody knows her. But we know her from pictures and movies and things. So the portrait was probably the most challenging. So I do a composite, which is how I was taught. So like I'll use a different person for the hands sometimes. I use my own feet half the time because they're free. You know, I just have them in the studio. And then like the shoes I used mostly from pictures because I didn't have the actual shoe. But the dress I had made, and we put on the model, and she posed there in the studio. Yes?
I was just curious, what eventually brought you to Frederick?
What brought me to Frederick? So initially, when I was that young, bright-eyed sculptor leaving Michigan, I came to work for Jay Carpenter, who lived in Montgomery County at the time, and he got a commission for 14 saints and holy people, and he did Louis Goldstein in Annapolis. Have you seen Louis over there? I did his pants. So, and then Jay got the commission for the Jim Henson Memorial. So he had kind of a banner year, and he needed some help. So I came to work for him, and there was another young artist who was working for him who lived in Frederick. Now, I was living in Gaithersburg on an artist's salary, And my friend who worked in the studio, he said, Sarah, you gotta come check out the Blue Elephant Art Center in Frederick, Maryland. And I said, okay, let's, and so I remember driving, it was like 10 p.m., and I was driving down Market Street, and Fifth Street was a really different place in 2000, and I came into this quirky old building with lots of cool artists, and I rented a studio for next to nothing in between a pile of glass and a brick wall and a pile of junk, and that was my first studio in Frederick, and I've been on and off Fifth Street for 20 years. So I say on and off because I move around sometimes. So I'm back on Fifth Street. Yep, and I'm still here. I love Frederick. Yes?
So weren't you working at the visitor center?
I was working at the visitor center with tourism because when we moved away and we moved back, and I love Frederick so much that I got in a car accident and had to take shuttles. And every time I told the shuttle driver, oh, have you been to this place? Oh, have you eaten at this restaurant? Oh my goodness, the Festival of the Arts is this weekend. And shuttle driver after shuttle driver said, do you work for the Tourism Council? And I said, well, no, but I love Frederick. And they're like, we've never met anyone who loves Frederick as much as you do. So when a job opening came up, it felt providential, and I went over there, so I worked there. And Asha loved having me work there because she got to come visit me, and we always do fun things. So, yes. Anyhow, thank you all so much.
Thank you all so much for coming. Like I said before, check out the exhibitions that we have. Grab a magazine on your way out and look at the things that we have coming up. We do 2 artist talks every month. Some of those will be online and some of them will be in person. We're figuring those things out as we go, as things change day by day. So give it up for Sarah again.